Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation and the Star Foundation.
Oh no! Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, the federal surplus. But before we get to the federal budget, a few words about the family budget. Mortgage, credit card bills, the kids wanting a new computer. It goes without saying that for most of us, there's seldom enough money to go around. But suppose, for one wonderful moment, just suppose that instead of having too little money, you suddenly found yourself with a big windfall, an inheritance, a bonus at work. What would you do with it? Would you use it to reduce your debt, paying down your mortgage? Would you invest it, buying stocks and bonds? Or would you blow it all on one glorious Caribbean vacation? Which brings us to the federal budget. You see, for several years now, for the first time in decades, the federal budget has been running surpluses, big surpluses. This year, the federal surplus is projected to exceed $280 billion. What should the federal government do with all that money? Pay down its debt? Invest it? Cut taxes? With us today, Milton Friedman. Dr. Friedman is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He was also an advisor to Presidents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. $280 billion. Milton will have a few ideas. Milton Friedman, with the sole exception of 1 year, 1969. In every year from 1962 all the way through 1997, the federal budget ran a deficit. In 1998, that changed. The deficit of all those decades was replaced by a surplus of $69 billion. In 1999, the surplus rises to $124 billion. In the year 2000, it rose still higher. And here we are, early in 2001, and according to the latest budget forecasts of the Congressional Budget Office, the surplus in 2001 could hit in the range of $270, $280 billion. What changed?
In the first place, you had a tremendous economic boom going on, which was raising incomes. And we have a tax system under which a 10% rise in income yields more than a 10% increase in taxes. People are shifted into higher brackets, they're shifted into paying higher rates of tax, so that without passing a law, the taxes go up more than proportionally to income. That's the first thing. So receipts went up as a result of the very rapid economic expansion. But the second...
So even as the American people have the sense that they themselves are doing pretty well, unbeknownst to them, the feds are doing even better.
Absolutely.
All right.
Very good. But second of all, we had gridlock. We had a Democratic president, a Republican House and Senate. Under those, if you had had an all-Democratic House and Senate, you would not have a surplus. It would have been spent. If you had had an all-Republican House, Senate, and White House, it would either have been spent or it would have been returned in lower taxes. But because you had divided government, you had, fortunately for the taxpayer, you had a gridlock. And the money was not spent, and that's the only reason you've had a surplus.
So this is a temporary anomaly that arises from a very good economy with money gushing in and the principal actors in Washington unable to agree on what to do with it.
Exactly.
All right.
And it will not last once you have, as you do now, a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican
All right, let's cast. The budget surplus may be temporary, but as long as we've got it, what should we do with it? The surplus could be used to increase government spending programs. It could be used to pay down the public debt, or it could be sent back to the American people in the form of a tax cut, or of course some combination of the three. Could we go through all three of those? Here is the case, as I understand it, for spending that surplus. Point one, as a practical matter, that's what Congress seems to want to do anyway. Last year, with the extra money coming in, Congress, which even then was controlled by Republicans, enacted more than 60 new spending programs. Our friend and colleague, John Cogan, an economist now participating in George W. Bush's administration, said to me the other day, you know what the definition of a surplus is? A surplus is when the money is coming in so fast that even Congress can't figure out how to spend it. So you have practical reality leans in that direction. As a matter of principle, the country faces an urgent need for productive capital. 2012, the first baby boomers, those born in 1947, begin to retire. The proportion of those in the working population to the whole population that needs to be fed, clothed, and housed shrinks. We need to increase their productivity by giving them greater capital. And higher government spending on research and infrastructure is a good way of increasing our stock of productive capital. So why don't we just spend it?
Well, carry that logic on, and you're saying government taking over the whole economy would be a good way of increasing productivity. That's an argument for socialism. We have socialism now, where the economy is 50% socialist. If you take
50% socialist, you don't mean the government owns the means of production?
Yes, of course. What does ownership of the means of production mean? It means you're entitled to the proceeds, to the income that they receive.
So they own 50% of
Well,
you
government,
and me.
if you take spending, federal, state, and local spending, it amounts to 40% of the national income. If you add in addition the mandates which government imposes on private spending, the government insists that you have anti-pollution devices on your car. That might as well be in the budget. If you add those plus the regulations and restrictions on enterprises, that accounts for about another 10%. So about 50% of the output of the country is controlled by the federal government, which is equivalent to saying that they own 50% of the means of production. So we're 50% socialist. But let's go back to your analysis. I think in all of these, you have to distinguish the economics of the subject from the politics of the subject. On purely economic grounds, government spending is adverse to productivity, not favorable to productivity.
Can you let me quote an economist, Barry Bluestone, who makes, I quote him not because this is hugely insightful, but because it's an argument that's in the air a great deal. I quote, "It was the federal government's investment that led to the internet. The latest theoretical breakthroughs in computer miniaturization are going on in university and private labs, but almost all the funding has come from the Pentagon."
There's no doubt that the Pentagon funding has led to research, but you don't know what would have been done with that money if the government hadn't been spending it. And in order to judge the efficacy of government spending, we have to look on a much broader range. How is it that a place like Hong Kong can have roughly nearly the same average income per person as the great United States economy can have? Surely it's not because of Hong Kong's plethora of resources. It's not
a rocky little
set of islands.
nothing.
It's because government spending in Hong Kong has been about 10 or 15% of the national income. It's now, under the new regime in Hong Kong, starting to go up, and Hong Kong is going to lose its vaunted productivity. It's that comparison of that versus the nearly 50% in the United States that explains how little Hong Kong can match the United States. So and if you take it further, we saw a society in which 100% of the spending was government, namely the Soviet Union. It's hardly an advertisement for government spending as a road to productivity.
What is it that is inherently inferior or less productive about government spending? When money is spent by way of the political mechanism, why is that inherently inferior?
Because nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own.
It is as simple as that.
That's a fundamental principle, absolutely. That's why I do not think government spending is the answer. On the contrary, I think government spending is much too high now from an economic point of view.
If Milton says no to government spending, what about paying off the debt? Option 2, get the debt off our backs.
From a purely economic point of view, that makes a great deal of sense. If it were feasible to take the whole surplus and use it to pay down the debt, I might well be in favor of it. The argument against that is political. That if you say you're going to pay down the debt, the political pressures to spend it are so strong that you will in fact spend it.
Now, hang on, I want to pause for a moment on the economic arguments there. Why would you rather pay down the debt than return the money in the form of tax cuts? That's a distinction between investment and consumption, is it not?
Yes.
All right. Could you explain that distinction?
I personally would rather have it to go back in the form of lower taxes.
Regardless of political considerations.
Regardless of political considerations.
All right. Now, why is that?
But the argument the other way,
Right.
the argument that people will make, the argument that supports that, is that if you pay back the debt, the money is going to people who will invest it.
Correct.
It's going to replace present assets, and they will try to get other assets, which will include investment.
Let me quote Robert Solow.
Right.
And you see the position I'm in. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist. You're a Nobel Prize-winning economist. How do I choose between the two? Robert Solow.
He's a very good economist.
Quote, reduction of the public debt will make more capital available to private business. Most of the funds previously tied up in treasuries will add to the demand for corporate securities. Some potentially productive investments that had been held back will now be more valuable, so they get made. Some businesses will finance productive investments that would not have been profitable. The business sector invests, the economy expands. That's the thing to do. But even in principle, you're not in favor of that.
Oh.
As against tax cuts.
The argument is a valid argument.
Right.
It would have that effect. But the question, is it appropriate for the government to decide how much of the public's money it should devote to investment and how much it should devote to consumption? Isn't that something for you to decide and for me to decide? Is that a proper national objective? I think not. I think that the total amount of investment ought to be the amount that individuals separately, you, me, and everybody else, that part of their income that they want to use for that purpose.
So you're making a moral argument.
Absolutely.
That is simply no business of the government's because it is no business of the government's.
Right.
All right. Now the political argument that you were making, you said you'd be open to paying down the debt if it were politically feasible.
It's not politically feasible because you quoted before the pressures on Congress to spend it. And those pressures mean that it will be spent. Look at what's been happening to the surplus so far. They've been getting rid of it as fast as they could under very difficult circumstances because divided government up to now has meant that it's hard to get agreement what to do. And even so, they've been able to put through a lot of government spending.
So the notion...
History shows, over a long period of time, government will spend whatever the tax system raises, plus as much more as they can get away with. That's why you've had universal deficits.
Okay, but now let me ask you a historical question. This form of government, the Congress, everything we live with today is set up over 200 years ago. And yet, federal government remains small relative to the economy, relative to the powers of state governments, small and even disciplined, one might say, right up through the middle of the last century.
That's right.
What happened then to change it? That is to say, the incentives, the fundamental institutional structures and incentives were always there.
Right.
What happened?
What happened was a Great Depression, which changed people's views. Before the Great Depression in 29 to 33, the general public vision was that the government was a necessary evil and that you should rely on the private market. The Great Depression was wrongly attributed. It was, in my opinion, it was produced by government mismanagement, but it was wrongly attributed to a failure of the capitalist system. And public attitudes changed drastically as a result of the Great Depression. From regarding the government as a necessary evil, they came to regard the government as the cure to all problems, as the answer to all problems. And that set in motion, beginning with FDR's New Deal, that set in motion a process under which government has been incrementally growing from then on.
Even under Ronald Reagan. Next topic, one of Milton Friedman's favorites, cutting taxes. Option 3, tax cuts. You favor that above all.
First of all, I favor it on economic grounds because it enables the ultimate consumer, the ultimate individual, you and me, to decide how the money should be used. You know, it makes no sense for me to send my money to Washington, to have somebody in Washington decide how to use it. I'd rather decide how to use it myself, whether for charity or for welfare or for other purposes. So that's the first and most important argument. But the political argument for it is that it's the only way to keep Congress from spending it. There is
if they don't have it.
If they don't have it. I have been, for a long time, I've been in favor of any tax cut, under any circumstances, in any way, in any form whatsoever.
On any pretext
on
or
any
excuse.
pretext, because that's the only way to keep down government spending.
Here's the argument against a tax cut. Again, Robert Solow. I quote, "Tax reduction, especially income tax reduction, fattens the disposable income of households. Most of it flows into consumption, only a small fraction is saved. The choice between debt reduction and tax reduction as ways of disposing of a budget surplus is mainly a choice between adding to investment is good, and adding to consumption, that is, between a provision for the future and enjoyment today." So you cut taxes, Milton Friedman, and all you're going to do is enable the American people to go on a brief, giddy spree.
Not a brief, giddy spree. I'm going to enable the American people to do what the American people want to do, not what Bob Solow thinks they ought to do.
Okay, so that again, though, is almost a moral argument.
Yes, that's a moral argument, absolutely. Are there any other arguments? Fundamentally, doesn't it all come down to a moral argument?
Well, now,
what's an amoral argument?
Well, as opposed to, say, an economic argument. I mean, you are at least open to the notion that, other things being equal, it would be a better idea to pay down the debt because that would promote investment than to engage in tax cuts because that would simply promote consumption.
If I believe that the government ought to decide what fraction of the national income should go to investment and what fraction should go to consumption, and if I believed that the government ought to, that right now investment is too low, then of course I would be open to that argument. But I do not believe that it's the government's business to decide what fraction of my income should be invested and what fraction should be consumed.
All right. Let's find out what Milton Friedman thinks of President Bush's plan for the budget surplus. You've just given, we've taken this through, we'll be sending a tape to this to the White House, and President George W. Bush has just heard it from Milton Friedman: cut taxes any way you can. Here's what he proposed during the campaign: only devoting about 25% of the surplus to tax cuts. 50% goes to Social Security and Medicare, and the remaining 25% or so to new spending programs. 25% of the surplus to tax cuts. Is that big enough for you?
No. And at least ought to be 50%, ought to include the 25% that's in there for new programs. We don't need new programs. We need fewer programs. You know, if there were only some way in which you could ensure that no law could be passed without repealing another law, we ought to have a law of conservation of laws.
You only get 400 laws, and if you want to pass a new one, you've got to subtract an old one.
But you can't do that.
It's not a bad idea.
Because a law can be anything.
Right now, lately, we're taping this show in the winter, early in the year of 2001. Lately, we have been hearing and reading from Washington, D.C., that because the economy is slowing, the Bush administration may accelerate its tax cut as a way of getting the economy pumped up and rolling along again. Paul Krugman, I think it's pronounced,
yes,
had an article in which he called this suggestion — he's no friend of the Bush administration generally, I quote him — a crude Keynesian view of economic policy. And he continued to say, again I quote him, "If Milton Friedman weren't still alive, he'd be spinning in his grave." Well, what do you make of that?
He's right.
He's right.
Absolutely.
But you just told us you'd cut taxes at any time, under any pretext, so let him cut taxes more.
I know, but that's not the reason for cutting taxes is not to stimulate the economy. I was just as much in favor of cutting taxes a year or 2 years ago when the economy was booming. I don't believe that the Keynesian remedies are valid. Now, it's an interesting thing. Bob Solow is a Keynesian, but he was against reducing taxes. He would be before. I wonder whether he would now be in favor of reducing taxes. I doubt it.
The Keynesians, there's no conceivable circumstance under which they're in favor of cutting taxes. So, but it is wrong for the government to stimulate the economy by cutting taxes, or it simply would not stimulate the economy?
It would not stimulate the economy. Look, if you want, I can give you a long theoretical argument as to what the problem, but just let me turn to one dominant fact.
All right.
You have Japan, which has been in a kind of a rolling recession for 10 years. In that period, it's had either 4 or 5 major fiscal stimuli programs.
That is to say, increases in government spending.
Increases in government spending and reductions in government taxes. They've been an utter failure. They haven't had any effect on the economy whatsoever.
On account of?
Because if the government spends more or less, Somebody else has less or more to spend. There's an offsetting element. Unless the government spending is financed by printing money, what really matters is what happens to monetary policy. If monetary policy goes one way and fiscal policy goes the other way, if you look at all such examples, monetary policy is always dominated, not fiscal policy. See, if government, if you reduce taxes, then people have more to spend. But on the other hand, government has less to spend. Why is there any net increase in total spending?
And so there's no net change in total spending, but on the contrary, as you've just instructed us, the people's money will be spent more wisely, more productively, and everybody's better off.
Right.
Okay.
So I'm in favor of the tax cuts, but not because you're in a recession.
Your view is accelerate the tax cut because the surplus is coming in faster than originally
That's
forecast.
right, exactly.
Just get that money out of Washington and back into people's pockets and bank accounts where it belongs.
Before Congress can spend it.
Before Congress can spend it. Okay. And that's the correct reason to do it.
Absolutely.
All right. Now that we have settled what to do with this. Last topic. Is a fiscal stimulus, such as a tax cut or increased spending, the best way to deal with a slowing economy? You just said that the old notion of a Keynesian fiscal stimulus, cutting taxes to stimulate the economy, boosting government spending to stimulate the economy, won't work. Well, we have George W. Bush getting comfortable in the Oval Office, but he has a problem, which is that the economy is softening and everybody's turning to him. What should he do?
Sit there. Let me give you a
Don't just do something, sit there.
Let me give you a comparable case. In 1980-81, just prior to that, we were in a situation where inflation was running 10, 12...
Double digits.
Double digits.
Double digits.
After the election, because before the election, in the 5 months before the election, the Fed was very stimulative. It was pumping money in like mad. A more rapid increase in the quantity of money in that 5 month period than any other comparable 5 month period since the end of World War II.
Was Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Fed at the time, culpable?
Absolutely.
Was that a direct effort to re-elect Jimmy Carter?
In my opinion, it was. At any rate, the month after the election, the money growth slowed down and went down very sharply. And the economy went into a recession. What did Ronald Reagan do? In my opinion, no other president in the post-war period would have stood by and sat there. But Ronald Reagan sat there and supported Paul Volcker in his measures. It brought an end to the inflation. It started us on our path of lower and lower inflation, of disinflation. And the recession lasted for a year and a half. It was a fairly deep recession. But it turned around in 1982, early 83.
August of 82 is when the stock market starts to recover.
And from then on, that's the beginning of this incredible period of good economic growth and of booming stock markets that we've had since. Now, the advice that everybody was giving to Reagan at that time was that he should step in and stop that recession from growing.
Right.
If he had done that, we would now still be having inflation in double digits.
We would never have climbed out of that whole stagflation of the 1970s.
So
the lesson for George W. Bush is
that if you stand still, if you just wait a while, it's not going to be a major recession. It'll be a minor recession if there is a recession. We still don't know whether we're going to have a recession. And I might tell you that the record of economists in predicting a recession is not one you would want to stand on. It's a very poor record. So we may not have a recession, but if we do, it will be like most post-war recessions, relatively mild. It'll last less than a year or a little more than a year, and then the economy will turn around and start going up again.
He should support Alan Greenspan in maintaining a stable and relatively predictable, that is, winks and nods to the market. People have some notion about where the growth of the money supply will come from,
Absolutely.
What it will be. He should cut taxes because he should cut taxes. He should lean against government increases in government spending. And for the rest of it, he should just sit there, sit tight.
So far as the recession is concerned.
So far as the recession is concerned. Milton, let me close it out then by asking you to make a prediction. You've just told us the economists don't predict recessions very well. I'm asking you now to make a political prediction. When George Bush the Elder left office, the federal budget showed an annual deficit of $290 billion a year. As William Jefferson Clinton left office, the federal budget was showing a surplus, almost a mirror image, of perhaps $280, $270, $290, maybe even $300 billion. When Bush the Younger leaves office, where will the federal deficit, or federal budget, what will the federal budget be showing?
Zero or deficit.
Zero or deficit, because that is the normal course.
That's right.
Of government in these times.
The situation right now is very abnormal. Under current governmental arrangements, the natural and normal way is to run a deficit, not to run a surplus.
Milton Friedman, thank you very much.
Glad to be here.
According to Milton Friedman, the federal surplus is an anomaly. What's normal and natural instead is for the federal government to run a deficit. I know just how that feels. I'm Peter Robinson. Thanks for joining us.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation and the Star Foundation.
This is PBS.